Thank you. Okay, let me share my screen. How is that?
Great.
Okay, wonderful. Welcome, everybody. So happy you're here and up and at it at 8 in the morning. So Patricia and I will be talking about nitrogen on organic farms. And it's such an important topic because you go to a lot of work to farm, to plant your seeds, to grow them, to transplant, to weed, to trellis, to irrigate, etc. And yet, if there's not enough nitrogen, all of that work can be compromised or cut short. And at the same time, if you're doing a lot of work to steward your environment, some of those efforts can be compromised because nitrogen becomes a pollutant. So, learning how to manage nitrogen properly is going to improve your farm. Secondly, it's a tough topic and it's complex, and I know that everyone here can become masters in nitrogen management. So, follow along and we'll get to your questions at the end. So, we're going to cover today how to understand the contributions of nitrogen from diverse nitrogen sources, how much you can expect from each of these sources, what factors affect nitrogen availability, when you need nitrogen and how much you need, and how to know your nitrogen status. So to begin, in organic production, most nitrogen comes to the farm in complex organic farms and forms. And so that's in plant residue, like cover crops or your crop that you're disking in, or in things like compost and most fertilizers. So there are these really complex forms that need to be broken down into simpler organic forms and then further broken down or mineralized into plant available forms, which are mostly nitrate, but to some extent ammonium. And so this process is called mineralization, and it's particularly important in organic production because all of these processes are done by enzymes, which are produced by microbes, and they happen faster at higher moisture and warmer temperatures. So, in order to mineralize nitrogen, we're relying on the little critters. And so, we're really focused on understanding the biology of these microbes and what they need to be good nitrogen mineralizers for us. In an organic system, there are multiple sources of nitrogen. Let's start at the bottom band. So this graphic is a model showing nitrogen input sources in the different colored bands. And this curve is the nitrogen uptake curve for tomatoes, just as an example. So if we start with this bottom band, this is soil organic matter. So this is the how much nitrogen is coming from soil organic matter. And you see this slight increase, a steady increase over the course of a warm season, so from April to September. And you can see by the end in this model that somewhere around maybe 80 pounds of nitrogen came from mineralization of the soil organic matter. The next band represents cover crops, and you see a steeper increase here. So that represents disking in your cover crop. It takes 6 weeks or so to mostly decompose, and you have a little bit of slow release after that. And in this case, you can see that another big chunk, maybe 60 pounds or so, came from the cover crop. And then we have compost, and you can also see kind of a steep band in those first few weeks, and a pretty significant chunk of nitrogen coming from your compost. And then we have fertilizers, which is a smaller band, but still important. And in some farms, the irrigation water can be a important source of supplemental nitrogen. So in this way, you can see how collectively all of these sources can build fertility to meet the needs of your crop, and in this case, tomato. So we're going to cover each of these bands in this workshop. So I'll pass it over to Patricia.
Thank you. So I'm going to start by talking about the things which are easier, the organic amendments. I'm going to distinguish between composts and fertilizers. So when I'm talking about composts, I'm talking about materials that are made by the aerobic oxidation of different feedstocks. So fresh things like manure or yard trimmings or things like that, put in a big pile, processed by microbes, they get really hot, organic matter gets broken down and stabilized, till you have a material that has smaller pieces and is more stable than what you started with. So this process reduces the mineral nitrogen content compared to the starting feedstocks. It increases the stability of the organic matter, so it won't be reacting as much when it's in the soil. Compared with fertilizers, they generally have a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio, so more carbon per unit nitrogen. And we'll find out later on why that's a very important number, so keep your ear open for C to N ratios. They're used in much larger quantities, they're much cheaper, and they're more heterogeneous. So they're a little bit less predictable. So some examples are like composted yard waste or manures, processing waste, vermicompost, and then there's all kinds of blends. So fertilizers, these are a different beast. They are sold in a bag. They have a guaranteed minimum nutrient content, and they often go through processing either chemically or physically or both, often in ways that make the nutrients more available when you put them in the soil. They also, compared to compost, tend to be much more uniform. They tend to release their nitrogen more predictably. Compared with compost, they often have a higher concentration of N, and they're much more expensive. So these are things to target at specific stages, rather than for building the soil fertility. So some examples are slaughter products like feather meal or granular blends of all kinds of different organic nitrogen sources, guano, liquids like fish or food emulsions or hydrolysates. And if we can go on to the next slide. This data is from an experiment that we did where we collected different organic nitrogen sources from organic growers around Yolo County. And we did a controlled lab incubation over 12 weeks, both in a soil from a long-term organic field and from a conventional field. And as it turned out, they weren't necessarily different. So this data combines the both of them. So it seems that the nitrogen availability is really more defined by the feedstock and defined by the product rather than by the soil. So these numbers can be used across many different types of soils. We measured the available nitrogen right at the beginning and then periodically over the course of 12 weeks. And it isn't a perfect mirror of what's in the field, but several experiments over time have shown that it can be a pretty good approximation of what to expect. So I want to go through some of the amendments, and we'll start with the lowest nitrogen amendments and the ones where you can expect the least nitrogen to become available. So with composted yard trimmings, that's that blue line here at the bottom. you can see very little release over the course of a season. And everything we measured was less than 5%. So these are really important for building overall fertility and the soil organic matter. But these yard trimming composts that often have a higher C to N ratio, a lower nitrogen content, you can think about them as releasing their nitrogen over the course of many years. Poultry manure compost, they're much different. They have a much higher nitrogen content. And if you look at the orange line, you'll see that quite a bit of that, like more than 15%, is immediately available in the form of ammonium. And slow release over the season, about 30 to 35% released by the end of the season. So you can think of these as releasing within weeks to months that nitrogen will become available. And I should mention, these were poultry manure composts that were composted with rice hulls from California, Central Valley. So poultry manure composts, they're really, really diverse, like all composts. So it's a good idea to, if you can, get an estimate, from the company or by doing your own testing, the percent nitrogen or the carbon to nitrogen ratio. We tested many different granular fertilizers. And again, remember, these have a guaranteed percent nitrogen content. So that NPK on the label, say it's a 444 fertilizer, that means 4% nitrogen, as well as 4% P2O5 and K2O. So we tested several different products from 2 to 7% nitrogen. And if you look at the green line here, this is just an example of one around the middle. Some characteristics is they have a quicker initial release. If you look from like the 0 to 7 days, a much quicker initial release than the composts. They're still releasing a little bit at the end of the season, but most of what they're going to release, they have by about 6 weeks. And the higher the nitrogen percent, the quicker it is for the release and the more is going to be available. So higher nitrogen materials tend to release their nitrogen more quickly and have more of it be available. For the, we tested a couple of slaughter products, blood meal and feather meal, and the nitrogen in these is protein. They're animal products. And so proteins, they're pretty simple molecules. They're really high nitrogen. So if you look at that yellow line, it starts out with basically nothing, and then more than 40% is released within the first 7 days. So these can actually, if you get them too close to seedlings, they can actually give them fertilizer burn because the release is so quick. And then they've pretty much released everything they're going to by 3 to 6 weeks. So these are really quick release products, and you can think of it as the nitrogen is being available within days, though it'll continue to supply a little bit later on. For the liquid fertilizers, that's that purple line, we found they behaved really similarly to the blood and feather meals. Though if you look at their percent nitrogen, that's that first column of the table, you'll notice it's a lot lower than these other quick release materials. And the reason for this is that when they publish the percent nitrogen on the bottle, it's the percent of the liquids plus the solid. So it's taking into account all the water in that liquid material. And so I'll show you later why that's an important, but it's a good thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about the moisture content of a material. We found it behaved really similarly to the slaughter products. Around 70% became available. But when you look at the literature, there's a really wide range, and it probably depends a bit on rate too. So the lower the rate, it's possible for these really quickly available products, the more is available. So we've put estimate between 50 and 100%. And again, probably more is going to be available the higher the percent nitrogen or the lower C to N ratio. And these again release within days. Guano, this is actually what conventional farmers used to use before we learned how to make artificial nitrogen. So this is a really quick release material. It's the fossilized manure of seabirds or bats, and high percent nitrogen, not that much carbon in it. And in the case of the material we tested, that's that gray line there, actually more than half of it was in the form of ammonium right at the beginning. This isn't very common when you look in the literature, but what is common is you get almost everything released within a week or so. And so about 80 to 90% release, and you can think of this also as being available within days. Next slide, please. And so when we mapped out the amount of nitrogen that was available over the season for all these different amendments against the material's carbon to nitrogen ratio, that's that top graph, or the nitrogen concentration, that's that bottom graph, we found a really strong predictive relationship. And so if you have a material that you're unsure of, to get a ballpark of what might be released under summer aerated growing conditions, you can look at, say, you have a C to N ratio of around 10 to 1. Look at where that brings you on the curve. And in this case, estimate maybe like 25% of that might be available. So this curve can be used to get a ballpark of what you might expect for a particular amendment, kind of across the board, for the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So something you'll notice for the percent nitrogen, it was a terrible predictor of the liquids because all that moisture is taken into account. And so if you're looking at a material like a compost that has a lot of liquid in it, make sure that the percent nitrogen you're looking at is the dry weight basis, or that the test report gives you a moisture content. And then again, for the liquids, probably it's best to try and get a C to N ratio, because moisture content doesn't matter for the C to N ratio, but it does for the nitrogen concentration. So next slide. So getting in the ballpark for optimum conditions, you can use the C to N ratio or the percent nitrogen. But then there's a couple of adjustments. Remember, Margaret was saying all these processes are done by microbes, and they're slower when it's cold. The drier it is and the colder it is, the slower these processes are going to happen, because they need moisture, they need heat. But we found they still do okay at colder temperatures. It's just a little bit slower. This is some data that we did from our experiment where we tested some materials at different temperatures, and then also Tim Hart's did some work. And based on this, what we say is just assume like a 1 to 2 week delay. The colder at colder temperatures, and can reduce it by a little bit. Expect very little effect for the liquid fertilizers, because remember, what's happening with availability is these microbes are producing enzymes that are breaking these chemical bonds. And so the fewer the chemical bonds there are to break, the less temperature dependent the process will be. So simpler materials are like with liquids, where they're often pre-treated with enzymes. That work has already been done. So those are going to be less temperature dependent. One thing that these graphs don't show, when the weather is colder, you'll get the nitrogen, it'll become available, but it'll stay in the form of ammonium for a longer time. There'll be a delay in that transformation to nitrate. And this is important because ammonium sticks to the soil. Ammonium has a positive charge, soil has a negative charge, and in order for that to become available to the plant, it needs to be exchanged. It's not flowing in the soil water. So that means that if it's in the form of ammonium, there'll be less chance of it being lost as with leaching, but it also means it won't be traveling in the soil as easily. The plants will have to do a little bit more work to get at it. And so this is why starter fertilizers are often put in a band near the plants, because they're often applied when it's cold. And so they won't be traveling so much in the soil. They won't be transformed to nitrate as quickly. And so you need to make sure that those little roots are able to be near that ammonium. Next slide. And remember, I also mentioned that moisture was a big deal. So this comes into play a lot when we're thinking about rates for fertilizers that are buried in the soil versus placed on top of the soil. And the same for compost. And we don't have good data about this. It really depends a lot on the material. But basically, if it's placed on the surface, mineralization will be slower and there will be less of it. And so if you look at these pictures here, you can think about how easily are those microbes contacting the material, and how what's the condition of the moisture. This is from an experiment that Richard Smith on the Central Coast did, where he took both a feather meal and a 444, and I put them in bags and either buried them in the soil or placed them on the top. And next slide, please. And as we mentioned, if you look at those dotted lines, those are the ones that are buried. You have a much quicker rate of release, especially for the feather meal, just because that has a much quicker rate of release under optimum conditions. And so from this, we say you can, just as a ballpark, reduce the total amount by probably 30 to 70% and assume that it will be slower. But we don't really have good data for this. We just know that it'll be less and it'll be slower. And one thing especially is if the material is manure or something that has a lot of ammonium initially, if you put it on the top of the soil and the soil is dry, you can often have loss to the atmosphere through volatilization, which is a process that's not done by microbes. It's just if you have a high ammonium material on the top of the soil and the soil is dry, and especially if the soil is a higher pH, you can lose quite a bit by this process. So reduce a little bit more if you know that you have those conditions. Next slide. So this is there's a lot of factors going into this. It's if only somebody would come up with a tool that could help you. Well, somebody has come up with a tool. This is from Daniel Geisler's lab, where Daniel Geisler, who's the nutrient management specialist at UC Davis, and Joji Muramoto, who's the organic specialist at UC Santa Cruz, took the data from this project and then also data from the literature and applied a temperature model to it. And so you can enter in different amendments and the date and the place, and it will give you an estimate. So if you can go to the next slide, and actually click 2 more times. So you can enter in your region, and that will get entered into the temperature model. You can choose the type of amendment, and the ones that are supported you see on the right, your application rate, that will tell you how much nitrogen is getting put in, and then the date, how long you're interested in, the depth of incorporation. Right now, it's because we don't have good data for surface, it's doesn't work for surface placement, but for the others it does. And if you notice, all of those have red stars. You have to put them in. For the amendment properties, it's good to put in whatever you have, but you don't need to enter in all that data. So say, for example, all you have is the total nitrogen. That's fine. Whatever you don't put in, it'll just fill in values from the literature. So it might be pretty off if it's like a fertilizer and you don't put in the percent nitrogen because it'll just assume the default. And then also remember how we were saying that moisture matters. If it's a compost, make sure that the value is either on a dry weight basis that you're looking at, or that you put in the amendment dry matter, or that you use the carbon to nitrogen ratio. And then for soil properties, click one more time. These are for if you're applying a really high carbon amendment with a high C to N ratio, the calculator needs to know how much nitrogen is already in the soil that can help the microbes break that down. But otherwise, this doesn't do much to the calculator. So click again. Yeah, and again, so this is an example that I did, 1/2 ton of pelleted manure applied in Yolo County, late March. I put in that it was a 4% material, and then it just filled in everything else. And click again. And what the calculator will give is an estimate of how much is available over time. And click one more time. So again, these are estimates based on the literature. So very important to monitor with soil and plant testing. And Margaret will be talking about that later.
All right, thank you, Patricia. I'm going to talk about cover crops and their contribution to nitrogen. So to revisit our organic nitrogen budget, Patricia just filled in our compost and fertilizer bands, and I will be talking about this cover crop band. So here's a picture of some grass cover crops. And so a couple of notes about the role of grasses in nitrogen management. So grasses, unlike legumes, rely on residual soil nitrogen. So nitrogen that is already in the soil, that's what they will use to grow. And they're excellent at finding that nitrogen. They have these big fibrous roots that can go deep and wide and into lots of soil pores. And so they're excellent at finding nitrogen and using it, incorporating it into that biomass and keeping it cycling. And they're really good at producing biomass. And so they can make a lot of above ground biomass if there's the nitrogen available for that. And importantly, when it comes to releasing nitrogen after it's been incorporated, grasses are typically a little bit slower at releasing that nitrogen compared to a legume. So legumes are famous because of their ability to extract atmospheric nitrogen. And so they're not relying on the soil nitrogen, although they can use that and they will use that if it's available. But if it's not available, they can take atmospheric nitrogen and transform it, fix it in their roots and use that to grow. And so they can provide a net positive input of nitrogen to the soil once that biomass is incorporated. And so that is one way to add nitrogen to the soil, as opposed to grasses, which will keep the nitrogen in that active plow layer. Secondly, because of the legume's ability to use atmospheric nitrogen and different properties of the plant, they typically have a higher nitrogen content in their tissues. And so when legumes get incorporated, they tend to release nitrogen more quickly in the short term. Many cover crops tend to be mixes. And so one of the benefits of mixing legumes and cereals is that you combine these benefits. So you get a robust root system that can both scavenge nitrogen in the soil and fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. And so regardless of the soil status, you can have a abundant cover crop because you've got legumes to cover. Okay, so let's look at some of the differences between these typical or common cover crops. So these are in order from low tissue nitrogen content, so lower nitrogen, to higher. So we have oats and rye at the bottom, followed by mustard, then bell beans, and then a cereal legume mix, and then all legumes, peas and vetches. Now, how much nitrogen can you expect in the short term? And this is reliant on that nitrogen content. So the more nitrogen concentrated in that leaf tissue, the higher availability of the N. So not only is there more, but more will become available in the short term. And so when we look at this figure, on the bottom axis, we have time. So we have weeks after incorporation. And on the vertical y-axis, we have the percent of the residue nitrogen that was mineralized. And these numbers written in here are the percent nitrogen of the tissue. So if you have a legume, for example, that is 3 to 5% nitrogen, let's say it's 4% nitrogen, by the end of 12 weeks, you could expect about 50% of the total nitrogen that is in that material to have become plant available. Whereas if you have a cereal cover crop that is 2% nitrogen, at the end of 12 weeks, you could expect maybe 10% of all the nitrogen that is in that material to have become plant available. So this is an important factor for understanding and predicting nitrogen availability from a cover crop. And this has big implications for what you can expect from that cover crop in your nitrogen budget. And so the exact same cover crop, if one year it was cut in early March, and in the second year, for whatever reason, it didn't get cut till early April, you could experience a significant decline in available nitrogen because it's older and it has a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio and less concentration of N in that tissue. And so if you were expecting the same thing to happen as the year before, you could get into trouble and have nitrogen tie up or just less nitrogen than you expected. And so this is a really important factor to understand in how cover crops can act different. The same cover crop can act differently from year to year. It could have to do with the age and concentration of nitrogen in that tissue. So if we combine these two, you can see that these oats and rye, they're at a pretty low rate, 10% availability. When we get to these mixes, we're then at 2.5 to 3%. So we're kind of intermediate. We're expecting maybe 20% of all the nitrogen, 20 or 30% of all that nitrogen to become available. And the peas and vetches, which have this lush growth, they're going to be more available, more like 30 to 50 or 60% availability. So the quantity of that residue is important because the nitrogen is all in the biomass. And so when we see biomass growing, we can see nitrogen growing. We can see the amount, the total amount increasing as that biomass increases. And so even though in legumes, the nitrogen fixation is occurring in these nodules in the roots, once that transformation occurs, that nitrogen is being moved up those roots and into this above ground biomass to build the plant. And so even in legumes, the nitrogen is being stored and built in the above ground biomass. So let's look at some pictures. If you're going to want to expect or predict how much nitrogen is in your cover crop, how do we start? So the first step is going to be starting to train your eye to know how much is out there. So we come back to this picture. It's about 2.5 feet tall. This is wheat. So what we're looking at is about 2.25 tons of biomass. It has a 18-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio and is about 2.7% nitrogen. Here's a vetch cover crop a little bit early in the season. So it's about 1.5 feet tall. What we're looking at here in this vetch strip is about 2 tons of dry biomass. It has a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 12-to-1 and is about 4% nitrogen. Here's a large diverse cover crop. It's got vetch and bell beans and peas. It even has a few grasses you can see up front here. So this is almost 3 tons of biomass. It has a 17-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio and is about 3% nitrogen. So as you can see, we're in that 2 to 3 tons of biomass, 1.5 to 3 tons of biomass for a late winter cover crop. And a great way to figure this out for yourself is shown here. So using PVC pipe, you can measure out a square, like a 3x3 square, like a yard by yard or meter by meter, whichever metric you like to use, and throw it into your cover crop in an area that's representative of your cover crop. And cut all that biomass all the way down to the ground. Collect it, stuff it into a garbage bag or a wheelbarrow or a tarp, and then dry it. And with that, you can get the dry weight. And then you take a sample of that and send it to the lab. And so once you have your percent nitrogen from your lab sample and you have your dry weight, you can then calculate how much nitrogen per acre you have in your cover crop field. And this can, if you do this a few times with a few of your cover crops and take pictures, you can then begin to train your eye and get pretty good estimates of what you have out there. And then this can become something that doesn't have to be done every year. So here's some examples. So we have the oats, again, all the way down to the vetch. So if we look at the biomass, the grasses produce a lot more biomass. And that's probably intuitively obvious. They produce a lot more biomass. Mustards, bell beans, and these mixes are intermediate. And the vetches and peas are on the lower end. And the reverse is true for the tissue and content. So the oats and the cereal rye have high biomass, but low tissue content. And then we come down to the vetches, and they have low biomass and high tissue content. So that's a simple way to think about how these different cover crops are contributing nitrogen. So then we can calculate our total N. We multiply the biomass times the tissue N content, and we get the total nitrogen in that cover crop. So 4 tons to the acre is 8,000 pounds times 1.7%, and we get 136 pounds. So you can see that in these materials, we have a range of 136 to 188 pounds of nitrogen. Then we need to think about availability. And we use this figure to think about availability. So if we have a vetch that has 3% nitrogen and 1.5 tons to the acre, that means we have a total of 90 pounds. We can look at our graph here and look at 3%. Okay, we're going to estimate 3% as about 40% of all of that available nitrogen will become available. I'll jump down to cereal rye at the bottom. This is older, so we only have 1% nitrogen, but we have a lot of biomass, 4 tons. So in terms of total nitrogen, we're not far off from that vetch. We have 80 pounds total. However, because of the age of it, little to none is going to become available in the short term. When you see this dip below 0, that means that that material can tie up nitrogen. So it actually is going to pull nitrogen from that soil to break it down. So that's thinking about the total nitrogen that's going to become available. And the next thing we can look at is when that becomes available. So let's take this schematic. We have time on the x-axis. And then we have the rate of mineralization. So if you incorporate a cover crop, you can see that it's assuming that there's moisture and maybe some moderate temperatures of the springtime, you can expect to see pretty consistent and relatively rapid decomposition. And somewhere around 4 weeks, most of it can be mineralized, 4 to 6 weeks. And so this can coincide with your planting. You want to make sure to give, typically it's recommended at least 2 weeks between incorporation, but if you can wait longer, it can be a little bit safer. But then you can see how you have this mineralization, and then you plant your crop and it will start to grow and use that nitrogen that's available. Okay, so if we apply that same calculation to our earlier figure, I'll just go across the top. One sec. So we're going to use this graph to do these calculations. So if we have 4 tons of biomass, 1.7% nitrogen, that's 136 pounds per acre. Well, 1.7%, if we look here, yeah, that's around 0. So we're going to estimate that we have a 0 release rate, and so we have 0 availability in the short term. Let's go to the other end of this figure, and let's look at Lana Woolly Pod Vetch. It makes only 2 tons of dry biomass, has a tissue N content of 4.7%, and so it has a total of about 188 pounds of biomass, total N in the biomass. So let's take 4.7. That's way up top here. So we're going to estimate about 50% of that's going to become available. So we can expect close to 100 pounds of nitrogen from our cover crop in the short term. So in summary, 0 to 50% of the cover crop can become available for the next crop. In the short term, you're going to have a higher nitrogen if it's harvested before flowering and with a high proportion of legumes. And you'll have lower nitrogen with older cover crops and grass-heavy mixes. And the quality, meaning the percent nitrogen and the C to N ratio, the quantity of that biomass, and the temperature and moisture will all have significant impacts on nitrogen availability from a cover crop. So you might be thinking to yourself, where's all this nitrogen going that I'm not getting until much later, whether that's from compost or cover crops? So it's building your soil organic matter. And a common rule of thumb is that during a summer growing season, so that warm temperature with some moisture, is going to be about 1 to 3% of total nitrogen becomes available. So that's 50 to 120 pounds in the top 12 inches. And so when we revisit this figure, you can see how that's creating this slow release. It's kind of a secret source of slow release fertilizer in organic systems. And so the more cover cropping and compost applications over time is building this soil organic matter bank. And you can see how temperature influences this. So we have two lines. We have two graphs. One of them is for Yolo County and one of them is from Salinas Valley. And the biggest impact you can see is that the Yolo County has a steeper kind of mountain, and that's because of the temperature. It's warmer, so it's going to stimulate more mineralization. And then these different colors of the curves represent soil organic matter percent. So the green curve on top in both cases represents 3% soil organic matter, and the black curve represents 1.5% soil organic matter. And so the more soil organic matter you have, the more daily release that you'll have. And so those are some basic concepts that you can see here. And you can see how in the warm season from April to October, you can have really significant release in warm seasons. Okay, and another way to think about this or to visualize this release, this kind of slow release that's happening in organic systems, and this has to do with the complexity of these materials that are being added, whether it's crop residue or manures. So in this visualization, you can, we're going to show how if you have the same amount of organic nitrogen that's added each year, which is 43 pounds of nitrogen, from a manure-based compost, how does that look over time? So in this first year, we have blue, you've added that compost, and it estimates that of those 43 pounds, you're going to get 28% of it. So that's about 12 pounds of nitrogen will be mineralized that year. Year two, you do the same thing, and that's represented in green. So you add 43 pounds of nitrogen, you're going to get 28% of that. But then the manure from last year is continuing to break down. And so you're going to get an 18% of last year's application. So then year three, this is continuing to happen and to build. So you do in this orange rust color, you do that 43 pounds of nitrogen application in manure again. You'll get 28% from that year's application. The green one, we're going to get 18% in the second year. And then we'll continue to get about 9% from the compost that was added in year one. And so in this way, you can see how with soil building practices, we're building our soil organic matter bank. And after a few years, we can achieve somewhat of a steady state where we're starting to get the benefits of multiple applications.
So we've talked a lot about the soil side of things when nitrogen is released. And a goal, and a very difficult goal for organic systems overall, is to match nitrogen availability to what and when the crop needs it. This is an art, and it's something that you zero in on. It's not something you can calculate, but there are some predictable things. An important thing to think about is the stage of the crop and how much nitrogen it's going to be needing. So I say plants are like us when they're babies. They don't eat that much. They're teenagers. They're growing like crazy. They need a lot. They get older. You need less. And it's the same principle. When you're growing quickly, that's when you need a lot. And so there's some patterns that that come out of this. So in this graph on the left here, this is broccoli, and that's an example of a crop where the product that's harvested is while the plant is immature. So things like lettuce or broccoli, where it's a leaf or a flower that's harvested, often they're taking up a lot of nitrogen right up until harvest. And in this example, we've shown winter broccoli that's seeded for winter is the blue line, and you can see because it's cold, it hangs out for a long time, and then when things start to heat up, it gets that growth curve, and starts taking up a lot of nitrogen up until harvest. Versus summer seeded, that green line, because it's warm right away, it starts taking up more quickly. But both of these are taking up a lot of nitrogen right up until harvest. The middle graph, that's in that case, fresh market tomato. And this is a good example of something where a mature fruit or grain is harvested. So in this case, it'll have that establishment period and then a period of really rapid growth where the nitrogen need is very high. And then the vine will stop growing as the fruit is ripening. And as the vine stops growing or starts to senesce and the fruit is ripening, you'll get lower nitrogen uptake. So in that case, as the vine is senescing, it won't be taking up as much nitrogen. For the last graph is an example of something where the product is continuously harvested and the plant doesn't really senesce or isn't senescing while it's being harvested. So strawberry is a good example of this. I think like greenhouse grown cucumbers and some like indeterminate tomatoes also do this, where you can have pretty steady nitrogen uptake even during harvest. So these are the broad patterns that you tend to see, and we've developed these curves for a lot of major California crops. So I've given you a QR code here. This is to a website that for many different crops will give just an estimate of, this is the amount of nitrogen total that a crop that has a yield expectation of a particular amount is likely to need, and then on average when it will need it. Next slide. And so this is important because, as we've talked about many times, once nitrogen is available, it's very dynamic. It can be leached, it can be lost to the atmosphere. So if it's not in a position where the plant is going to be directly taking it up, it's more at risk of loss, and it needs careful management. And a lot of times there's not too much we can do about this, because organic systems, they need to have this front loading. So this graph that I'm showing here, this is the same graph we've shown over and over again, except instead of the total amount of nitrogen or plant uptake, it's the rate per day. So this brown is soil, the green is when you incorporate the cover crop, it has a really quick mineralization for the first few weeks. The blue is the poultry manure compost. Again, pretty, most of it's going to be mineralized in the first 6 weeks or so. Fertilizer, that's even quicker. So in this case, where we have a pre-plant fertilizer and cover crop and poultry manure compost incorporated a few weeks prior to planting this tomato crop, you can see that almost all of the nitrogen that will become available from these amendments is already available really a few weeks before the crop is really going to be taking it up. And so a big point here is just to be very aware of irrigation management during this time, that this is a time when nitrogen can be very easily lost and can have effects later on in the season. Another thing I want to bring out of this graph, if you look at this brown line here at the bottom, that's what Margaret was calling like the secret nitrogen source, the soil. And notice that it's the only source where the pattern of release follows the same pattern as uptake. And so just as a general principle, the more nitrogen that's able, the more nitrogen from the budget that comes from the soil, just the more intrinsically efficient the system is going to be. So again, building up the soil fertility with these sources that might not be as available during the season is going to be an important component. Next slide. And then just to make the point that with fertilizers, even though you're just giving a little shot here and there, and it's a relatively small amount of the budget, because they're so high availability and quickly available, they do give you the flexibility to make adjustments in the season to help match the nitrogen uptake. So this graph on the left, that's where we did that pre-plant application of the granular fertilizer. The graph on the right shows we made a side dress application around 2 weeks after planting. And you can see because it releases so quickly, most of it that's going to be available already is available just at that time of right before the growth really takes off. And then this also demonstrates what it would look like to do a bit of a mid-season water run application of liquid fertilizer during that period of rapid growth. So just as a way to, an additional tool in the toolbox to help improve the nitrogen use efficiency. Of course, then the big question is, all of these are numbers, they're all modeled, they're all modeled from different systems. How applicable are they to your farm and to your field and to your crop? And this is a great use of tools. So Margaret's going to talk a little bit about how do you check for your crop and your field? How do you know if it needs nitrogen?
Thank you, Patricia. Yeah, so this is the final bit of our session today, is just reminding folks to do some testing. Nitrogen, unlike other nutrients, is very dynamic. It can be leached with irrigation, water, and rain. It can volatilize. It can be used by the plant. So its levels are changing very quickly and a lot over the course of the season or the year. So it's one of the nutrients that needs to be monitored more closely. And the main ways to do this are by taking leaf tissue analyses or soil nitrate analyses. And then I have this last little plug to set up a simple strip trial. And so this is an example of like an area. If you have the luxury to leave an area unfertilized, or to remove the cover crop or something like that, you can use that to help you understand how your practices are contributing to nitrogen. So, but back to these analyses, the goal is to either make an adjustment for the current season or to help build your knowledge to improve next season's management. So leaf tissue analyses are ones that are done during the season to check your crop. Your crop of interest. And so these nutrient concentrations in leaves will decrease as the plant matures, and different plant parts have different concentrations. And so in order to take a leaf tissue sample, send it to a lab and use it, you want to make sure that you're using the right plant part at a certain time of its growth, so that you can compare those levels to the published values. And whether you do it at a lab and compare the levels that they give you, or you do it online, to compare levels. All of those sufficiency values are based on a certain plant part and at a certain age. So just be sure to check the correct process before taking your leaf tissue analyses. But they're an excellent way to check whether your plant has enough nutrients. And they're really best at checking for deficiency. And then another great test that is very cheap and quick, and you can do it at home, are these nitrate quick tests. And basically, you take a composite sample of your field, mix it with some water, and then you do a little like dipstick, and it will reveal an indicator of your nitrate level, and you compare it to a colorimetric graph on the bottle to get a rough idea of how you're doing. And so this can really highlight if you have a deficiency, especially. And so this can be a really nice way to kind of monitor things more quickly and kind of consistently without the expense and time of sending it to labs. But you can also do those. So a combination of both is really a nice way to kind of monitor your nitrogen status on your farm. You can buy these strip tests online. They're basically about $1 a piece, $1 a strip, and they can come in 25 or 50 strip containers. So this is really educational and important for nitrogen monitoring. And then how do you interpret those little tests? So you want to do this before a fertilization event to determine kind of if you need to do a fertilization event, and if so, how much. And then 20 ppms of soil nitrate in the top foot, so the top 12 inches, is equivalent to about 70 or 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And in general, this is sufficient to supply a crop for about 1 to 2 weeks. But you can go into the specifics of your crops, and I just took a screenshot on the right of, these are the California fertilization guidelines, and I just picked one for melon. And if you look at the top bar that says nitrogen with a little arrow, I clicked over on plant analysis and I clicked on that. See, it's timed with, the plant cycle. So I'm in the like flowering, fruit bulking, maturity stage. And I clicked on the plant analysis. It'll give you information on what tissue to take. And then you can look at the numbers below. So for example, it says early flower. You want the whole leaf percent nitrogen to be between 2.7 to 4%. And that would be a sufficiency range. Okay, so to summarize our talk today, most nitrogen sources need to be transformed by microbes. Oh, Patricia, here, you jump in and you can take over from here. Thank you.
Okay. So nitrogen concentration and the C to N ratio are useful for predicting the amount and timing of available N, kind of getting in the ballpark. Slower nitrogen mineralization at lower temperatures, slower and less mineralization if placed on the surface. Oh, sorry, next bullet. Fertilizers, useful for small targeted applications. Next one, cover crops and compost, useful for building soil fertility. These are what are really building the soil organic matter. And for cover crops, you can expect up to 60% of the total nitrogen in the crop biomass, but depending on the C to N ratio, percent nitrogen. Soil organic matter, don't underestimate it. It can release 50 to 120 pounds of N per acre in the top 12 inches over the warm months. And the more soil organic matter you have, the more nitrogen you'll get from it. And just remember the goal over time, match the nitrogen amount and timing to the crop demand to improve efficiency. And fertilizers allow side dress applications if they end up being needed. And then just nitrogen can be monitored and also needs to be monitored more frequently than the other nutrients. So with that, I want to give a plug to all of this information. And a lot more is in a publication that we put out a couple years ago, estimating nitrogen availability in organic production. So it goes step by step through the budget and also has a worksheet with worked examples and also places where you can do your own. So this is freely available online and it's a great resource. And then the next slide, we have a couple of other links to other resources. So the California Fertilization Guidelines that Margaret was talking about, the nitrogen calculator that I was talking about, and then we have a couple of videos about estimating nitrogen availability that are available on Margaret's YouTube channel. So with that one, thanks very much. And I think we have time to answer the questions you put in the chat. And feel free to put in any more. And also, if things occur to you later, we have our email addresses up there. So feel free to reach out. Somebody had a really interesting comment. Will bird flu affect the safety of poultry manure? I don't want to go on record as saying it won't. I looked up a couple of papers, and for the for the strains that they've been tested, the virus is killed or at around 55 degrees Celsius, which is a fair amount less than what most thermophilic composting gets to. So I know for people getting rid of compost or carcasses and waste, it's recommended to compost it. Margaret, do you have anything to add? And I guess the main risks are to the human workers. And so if it might be a good idea now to be wearing some extra protection just in case. It shouldn't, yeah, the heat should kill it, but to be extra careful, be careful of yourself and your workers. It won't be as much a problem for the plants.
That's great, Patricia. Thank you. Yeah, do you have labs to recommend to Southern California? You could reach out to your UC Cooperative Extension advisor that's near you, and they can possibly recommend a lab. Especially for nitrogen and kind of most macro micronutrients, most California labs will do a great job. I think the benefit of using a local lab is to save you on shipping costs. But also finding a lab in California is nice because they're familiar with California conditions and are using California values to make different types of recommendations. And then finding a lab, choosing a lab, finding a lab, and then sticking with it will give you the most accurate results. So different labs have slightly different methodologies, and it can affect your values. So we highly recommend using the same lab repeatedly to really be able to monitor your results over time. Do you have any other thoughts, Patricia?
No, I agree with all of those. There's a comment in the chat that some fertilizers are more likely to burn plants than others, and can explain why this is. The big things to take into account are the salts and ammonium. Like both of these can have direct toxicity to plants that cause burning. And so for your example, chicken manure fertilizer is being a potential risk. You're applying a lot of it, and it tends to have a fair amount of ammonium. And it also can have more salts. So that would be my guess, is just anywhere where you're likely to get a big flush of ammonium, you'll be more likely to burn. Whereas things that you're using at a lower rate or are more dispersed or have less ammonium or a lower salt content, those will be less risky. Anything to add?
think that sounds great. Okay, we have a couple more in the chat. If you mow a cover crop instead of disking it, how much of the nitrogen is lost to the atmosphere from volatilization? Do you have a number for that, Patricia?
I don't think that research has been done. We really want, I think there are people working on looking at kind of surface applied cover crops, but it's really, really difficult to measure mineralization from things on the surface. And so far as I know, there just isn't good data on that. You probably won't get much volatilization necessarily, is my guess, just because I don't think, unless it's a really fast mineralizing thing, I don't think that the ammonium content would ever get that high, and it's ammonium that's mineralizing. But I don't have, so that would just be my guess, but I don't really have numbers.
Right. And using kind of the best gauge, which isn't a great one, but mediocre, is, like Patricia said, leaving the data we have from just leaving fertilizers on the surface is a proxy. What is the end release of a mixed grass legume weed cover crop in a no-till orchard where biomass is left on the orchard floor? Okay, I think that's similar to the question we just addressed.
Yeah. And yeah, we're in time, so we need to start wrapping up. I know there's
Okay.
questions.
Great. Well, if folks still want questions answered, you can send them over to Patricia or me by email. So thank you everyone for your interest. And we have ongoing nitrogen workshops, so you can stay tuned to hear about those.
Thanks,
Yeah.
everyone.
Thank you everyone for participating. There's many more workshops to come, so we'll see you around. Bye.